Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Andy Davies there with that exclusive report. With me now is Casper Walsh, a former offender who now runs the charity Right to Freedom, which helps inmates and ex-offenders. And we're joined from Cardiff by Natalie Gilbert. Her husband, Johnny, who you saw in that report, is serving a 12-year sentence in Park for mortgage fraud while he was a solicitor. Natalie, let me ask you first. Thanks very much for joining us. You saw Johnny very emotional in that report when he thought about the impact being in jail had had on your children. An impact, though, on you too, I assume?
Yes. We were a very close family. My husband didn't go out to work for the 5 years or so before he went to prison, so we spent a lot of time together. He did a lot of things with me, with the children, for the children. And then overnight that's just shattered, and then you're left to try and pick up the pieces, make sure the children are okay, and try and deal with your own emotions at the same time.
And obviously that must have a devastating effect on you. Do you feel angry with him? Do you blame him for what happened?
No, I think we were waiting a long time for my husband to come to trial, so we had a long period of time ahead of that together where we worked through all of that. And obviously initially I was angry and disappointed. He'd risked everything and risked destroying our family. But by the time he actually went to prison, it was just a huge feeling of loss, really, a bit like a bereavement.
What do you see that effect on other mums as well? Do you notice that?
Yes.
How does it affect people differently in different ways? What have you noticed?
I chat to a lot of the other mums when I take the children to the homework club, because obviously we wait for them in the lounge. And I think we all share quite similar experiences. I think we all liken it to a bereavement initially. And it's hard because you then become everything to the children, and you're trying to make everything as normal as you can and do everything for them on your own, whilst also trying to come to terms with it yourself.
Let me turn to Casper now. And your dad spent quite a bit of time in prison, and you did too. How hard did you find it to avoid what must have felt at some point like a sort of criminal destiny in a way?
Well, just say that I didn't spend a lot of time. I spent some time. He was the one that spent years and years, and I managed to avoid that. I avoided it by going to prison and basically being frightened by the prospect of what I'd seen happen to my father over the years that I'd visited him in prison. And I knew that, and I'd seen it, and I'd been inside many, many prisons throughout the UK. And he told me stories about what had happened, and so it was primarily fear and a determination that I wouldn't go down the same path as him.
And would the kind of contact that Natalie's husband has been able to have with his children, their children, would that have helped in any way for you?
I did have contact through the probation service, and it did help, and it provided me with a touchstone. It provided me with something to hold on to in a time when I wasn't around him, which was most of the time when he was in prison. I only saw him when I actually went to visit him. So yeah, it was an opportunity for me to hold on to it. And if I'd had more of that, maybe my crimes wouldn't have gone on for so long, and I wouldn't have taken so long to get into rehabilitation. But it's absolutely essential that support is there.
Well, Natalie, do you and the other mums you talk to, do you fear that your children might end up following some kind of criminal path, or do you try and put that out of your mind?
I think some of the mums do. I think from my perspective, my biggest concern is the emotional effect on them. My husband was in Wandsworth prison for the first 3 months of his sentence, and I can remember my eldest son, Zach, who was 7 at the time, said to me he felt like he didn't have a dad anymore. And he was struggling to come to terms with that and to understand why. And I think that concerns me really more than them following any sort of similar path.
Well, Casper, you've been talking about rehabilitation. I mean, how possible is it to contemplate this kind of rehabilitation that's going on in Park when you've got jails that are in, quite a bad state, according to the Chief Inspector of Prisons last year? And you're talking about the violence, drug abuse, self-harm, that kind of thing. How feasible is it to contemplate this kind of rehabilitation?
I think it's absolutely feasible, and I think that it's happening. And what's charities like the one that I work with, Right to Freedom, that I've set up, is coming in from the outside and working in partnership with prisons, and we've been working with PART for many, many years. So I think it's by having outside organisations coming into the prison and working with a very difficult situation because of the prison cuts. There's been a 40% reduction in staff over the last few years. And I was quite struck by Cameron's statement about the state of prisons and, you know, that he wants to get into reform, which is fantastic. But it's the austerity and the cuts that have made things really difficult.
Well, Caspar Walsh and Natalie Gilbert, thank you both very much for joining us. Very interesting to hear your stories. Thank you.
I've been getting